He recorded over 600 songs across a career that reshaped American music forever, and for almost 70 years now, people have been arguing about a question that sounds simple but genuinely is not. What was Elvis Presley's single biggest selling record? And here is the part that should stop you in your tracks. Even Elvis himself never settled on one answer. In one interview he pointed to a certain ballad as his personal biggest seller. On stage, in front of thousands of fans, he would joke about a completely different track, telling audiences with a grin that it was not necessarily his best work, it just happened to sell more than anything else he ever touched. 60+ years later. Record historians, chart archivists, and die-hard collectors are still fighting over the paperwork. Some numbers come from official industry certifications. Some come from RCA's own internal shipping ledgers, numbers the public almost never saw. Some are inflated legends passed down through decades of tabloid retelling. And when you actually dig through the receipts, city by city, country by country, contract by contract, the real answer is stranger, messier, and honestly more interesting than the story most casual fans have been told their entire lives. So today, we are doing something nobody else has really done properly. We are counting all the way down, from the smallest verified seller in his legendary catalog, all the way up to the single release that outsold every other piece of vinyl Elvis Presley ever put his name on. And I promise you, the song sitting at number 1 is probably not the one you're picturing right now. Let's start at the bottom of this list, because even Elvis's so-called smaller hits would be the career-defining moment of an entire lifetime for almost any other artist in history. Coming in at number 14 on our countdown is the song that arguably started the entire revolution. A song originally written by Carl Perkins, a track that in Elvis's hands stopped being a country tune and became something closer to a declaration of war against the musical establishment of the 1950s. On April 3, 1956, Elvis stepped onto the stage of the Milton Berle Show and delivered a performance so physically explosive, so unapologetically wild for its era, that it genuinely shocked television viewers across the entire country. Parents wrote angry letters. Preachers gave sermons about it. And teenagers everywhere ran straight to the record store. That single burst of national exposure triggered a buying frenzy so intense that the original release sales pushed past the 2 million copy mark. Now, compared to some of the numbers we are about to walk through, 2 million might sound almost modest. But its real value was never really about the raw sales figure. It was about what that record represented. It was the wardrobe, the attitude, and the rebellious sound of an entire generation crystallizing into 3 minutes of vinyl. Number 13 takes us into a very different chapter of the Elvis story, the Hollywood movie machine years. This track, built around a swinging saxophone groove, was written for the soundtrack of one of his feature films, and honestly, it represents the peak efficiency of that entire era of his career. Where the earlier rockabilly records were raw and dangerous, this one traded rebellion for polish, and polish for pure mass appeal. At its center is a deceptively simple story about a returned letter, wrapped around a hook so catchy that listeners could not shake it out of their heads for weeks. And the calculation absolutely paid off. The single logged a massive amount of radio airplay, achieved platinum certification, and racked up reported worldwide shipments of over 2.5 million copies. It proved something important about Elvis as a commercial force. He did not need danger to sell records. Sometimes a clean, catchy pop song could conquer the mainstream just as completely as a scandalous stage performance. Sitting at number 12 is the moment Elvis Presley quietly reinvented himself in real time. Gone is the wild, hip-shaking swagger. In its place, a quiet acoustic guitar and a vocal performance built on the haunting melody of a Civil War-era ballad. This is the record that proved his voice could stretch far beyond raw rockabilly, that he could be a genuine romantic crooner and not just a rebel with a guitar. What happened commercially with this song is almost hard to believe today. Before the single was even physically pressed and shipped to stores, fan demand generated pre-orders that blew past 1 million copies. 1 million orders before the record even existed on shelves. That wave of advance orders secured him a gold record before the song had even debuted on the radio, and it proved conclusively that his commercial appeal could dominate the softer pop charts just as easily as it had dominated rock and roll. Number 11 is genuinely one of the strangest entries on this entire list, and it is proof that Elvis's commercial story was never confined to American borders. Recorded during his military service transition in Germany, this playful, looping, almost toy-like track was adapted from a traditional folk melody and released with multilingual appeal built directly into it. Here is the twist. On American radio, this song barely registered. Most casual domestic fans have genuinely never heard of it. But across the United Kingdom and Europe, it triggered a retail restocking frenzy so intense that pressing plants could not keep up with demand. The overseas numbers alone eventually pushed the single past 3 million copies sold. It is a perfect reminder that Elvis's commercial empire was never purely an American phenomenon. Sometimes the biggest explosions happened continents away from where anyone in the United States was paying attention. At number 10, we move into the late 1960s, a period that is often remembered as Elvis clawing his way back from years of forgettable movie soundtracks. This track hits differently from almost everything before it on this list, because it is not a love song or a novelty record. It is a gritty, socially conscious piece confronting poverty and hopelessness on the cold streets of a major American city. For an artist who had spent the better part of a decade trapped in lightweight Hollywood material, this was a genuine creative gamble. And audiences responded to the raw emotional weight of it in a massive way, pushing physical single sales close to the 3 million mark. This record played a real role in resurrecting his commercial credibility during the legendary 1969 comeback sessions, and it proved that his voice could still capture something real and urgent about a changing, turbulent country. Decades after he first walked into a recording studio, number 9 might be the most unlikely commercial success story on this entire countdown. This is a solemn, echoing, openly religious gospel recording, made back in 1960, that then sat locked away in a vault for 5 years because of a bitter contract dispute. By the time it was finally released in 1965, industry insiders had essentially written the song off. Explicitly spiritual material, they assumed, simply did not sell in the mainstream marketplace anymore. They were spectacularly wrong. This quiet hymn blindsided the entire music industry, emerging out of nowhere as a genuine commercial hit and pushing physical sales close to 2 million copies. It remains one of the purest examples in his catalog of pure vocal power overriding every single market expectation stacked against it. Number 8 brings back the speed and urgency that a lot of casual fans assumed Elvis had left behind in the previous decade. Recorded live, in the Room, on March 28, 1972, inside RCA's Studio C, this track captured an explosive, unmanufactured energy driven by legendary session players who pushed the tempo hard and the drums even harder. It proved, loudly and unmistakably, that the raw rock and roll fire had never actually gone out. It was just hiding underneath the rhinestone jumpsuits of his later Vegas-era stage shows. The public responded with real force, pushing shipments to nearly 3 million copies and driving the single all the way up to number 2 on the American charts. It stands today as one of his final full-throttle assaults on the mainstream rock charts, a genuine late-career reminder of exactly how much raw power was still sitting inside that voice. Number 7 takes us somewhere much darker and far more intimate, and honestly, this might be my personal favorite entry on the entire list, because the backstory behind the recording session is almost as compelling as the song itself. This track was recorded almost entirely in total darkness, at the direct request of his manager, an attempt to strip away every distraction and force pure emotional exposure out of the performance. The atmosphere in that room was reportedly so heavy that the silence before his vocal even begins feels almost physical when you listen back to it today. When Elvis shifts into the famous spoken word section of the song, his hushed, intimate delivery reportedly stunned the recording engineers watching the needles jump on the mixing console in the dark. This is one of the rawest, least polished, least performative vocal takes in his entire discography, completely stripped of the usual rock and roll bravado or Hollywood movie star gloss. And the gamble paid off on a genuinely global scale. This stark, fragile ballad connected with listeners across the entire world, ultimately driving more than 5 million physical copies sold internationally and dominating charts on multiple continents. It is proof, if you ever needed it, that restraint can hit just as hard commercially as volume. Number 6 pulls us back into the legendary 1969 comeback sessions, arguably the single most important recording period of his entire career. A driving, urgent guitar riff, layered underneath a building, brassy horn section, immediately signals a completely different kind of energy, modern, tense, almost paranoid in its urgency. This was the sound of a revitalized artist fighting with everything he had to reclaim his crown, blending soul influences into raw rock and roll in a way nobody expected from him at that point in his career. Beyond the incredible musical energy itself, this track carries one of the most famous production tricks in the history of pop music. The producer deliberately engineered a fake fade-out partway through the song, tricking listeners into believing the track had ended, only for the rhythm to slowly build back up and explode again over a looping groove. That trick famously fooled radio disc jockeys across the entire country, and it kept millions of listeners glued to their radios waiting to see what would happen next. The gamble paid off in a massive way. Reported shipments hit 4.5 million physical copies, and most significantly of all, this track stands as his final number 1 hit on the American pop charts, the last time he ever reached the absolute summit of the mainstream music world. Number 5 takes us all the way back to the explosive beginning of his major label career, and honestly, understanding this record means understanding the myth that grew up around it. A slow, dragging blues piano and a heavy, ominous bassline turn raw isolation into what became a full-blown commercial detonation. According to long-standing label lore, the songwriters behind this track were inspired by a newspaper story about a lonely man who took his own life, leaving behind a note with a single haunting phrase about walking a lonely street. Now, historians have spent decades digging through newspaper archives trying to track down that original article, and nobody has ever actually found it. It may well be industry legend rather than documented fact. But true or not, the story only added to the record's dark, mysterious appeal. Even the RCA producer overseeing the session reportedly worried at the time that the recording sounded too strange, too morbid, to ever connect with a mainstream audience. The public disagreed almost violently. The single shattered existing sales records and earned a gold certification within weeks of release, marking Presley's first ever officially certified million-selling single. Some later industry accounts claim total shipments eventually crossed 4 million copies worldwide. But the real legacy of this record was never really about a specific number. It was about launching an entire cultural phenomenon from a standing start. Number 4 brings us a gentle, cascading piano melody that feels almost like a warm exhale after everything that came before it on this list. This is the unmistakable sound of a cinematic ballad that grew far beyond its original movie soundtrack roots. Adapted from a classic 18th-century French love song and originally written for one of his beach-set Hollywood films, this track became something much bigger than a soundtrack cut. It became the emotional anchor of his live shows, the song he would use to close out concerts for essentially the rest of his touring career. The physical shipment numbers on this one are genuinely staggering, easily topping 6 million copies worldwide, earning platinum certification, and cementing its place as one of the true giants of his entire catalog. And here is where the story stops being simple, because the final 3 entries on this countdown drag us directly into a genuine forensic mess of conflicting sales claims, double-sided vinyl releases, and missing overseas paperwork that historians have been arguing about for literally decades. To understand who actually wins this countdown, we have to leave straightforward fandom behind entirely and step into a world where the definition of the biggest hit completely fractures depending on who is doing the counting. Number 3 is a record that cannot really be understood outside the context of the single it was physically released alongside. Built around a sharp, steady snare drum backbeat and a warm rolling bassline, this track became part of one of the most successful vinyl singles ever pressed in American history, paired directly on the same 7-inch record with another massive rock and roll powerhouse on the flip side. Together, that combined single generated somewhere around 6 million domestic copies sold, an absolutely unstoppable retail force that filled record players in households across the entire country. On the Billboard charts, this particular side of the record held the number 1 position for an incredible 11 consecutive weeks. setting a rock-era record that would stand completely unchallenged for the next 36 years. The success was so overwhelming that Elvis himself used to joke about it during later live shows, telling audiences with a laugh that it was probably not his best song, it just happened to sell the most. But here is exactly why this entry stops short of the top spot on our list. Because it was released as one half of a double-sided single, the sales figures for this specific song alone get tangled up with its flip-side partner, and that tangle is exactly what holds back the final verdict. Number 2 might genuinely be the song most casual fans would guess sits at the very top of this entire countdown, and honestly, it is easy to understand why. A soaring, almost operatic vocal line sweeps over a gently swaying mandolin rhythm, capturing the exact moment Elvis Presley conquered the global music market on a scale nobody had managed before him. Recorded in 1960, shortly after he returned home from military service, this grand, sweeping ballad borrowed its melody from a classic Neapolitan standard dating back to the late 1800s. The result was arguably his single biggest international triumph. It spent 8 straight weeks at the top of the British charts and earned a rare gold certification in Germany, numbers that most American artists of that era could only dream about. And this is exactly why the song stops just short of the very top. The scale of its success is so enormous that the actual global sales figures fluctuate wildly depending on which source you trust, with some conservative estimates landing around 5 million copies worldwide, while other, more generous estimates claim more than 20 million, largely because so much of the overseas paperwork from that era was never properly archived or has simply been lost to time. Fascinatingly, during a famous 1961 press conference in Memphis, Elvis himself pointed directly at this song and called it his single biggest seller of his entire career. But music historians and record industry auditors who have spent years digging through the actual documented ledgers argue that when you strip away the estimates and the legend and focus purely on verified, audited numbers, the true commercial crown actually belongs somewhere else entirely. And that finally brings us to number 1, the record that, according to the actual audited RCA shipping ledgers rather than the more romantic legends fans have repeated for generations, stands as the single biggest selling piece of vinyl Elvis Presley ever released. A frantic drum roll and a wild, throat-shredding scream open this track, and honestly, it still sounds like a warning shot fired directly into the heart of conservative 1950s America. This is the undisputed heavyweight champion of physical record sales in his entire catalog, released as a double-A side single in July of 1956, and pressed onto a single, unstoppable piece of vinyl that ended up shipping more than 10 million copies within the United States alone. Casual fans, understandably, often assume the crown belongs to one of the later movie ballads, or one of the huge international hits we just walked through. But when record historians and industry auditors go back and pull the actual internal shipping ledgers rather than relying on modern estimates or old interview soundbites, the numbers point directly and unambiguously at this release. Together, both sides of this single dominated the Billboard charts for an incredible 11 consecutive weeks, a rock-era record that stood completely unbroken for 36 years afterward. And while the official industry certification recognizes a 4 million unit multi-platinum award, that figure only reflects a modern retroactive certification standard. The original internal RCA shipping paperwork tells a much bigger story, one that places this single record far beyond anything else Elvis Presley ever put out, before or after it. Now here is my own honest read on why this particular answer feels so satisfying, and honestly so fitting, once you actually sit with it for a minute. It would have been so easy for the biggest seller of his entire career to be one of the polished, safe, movie soundtrack ballads, the kind of song built by committee for mass appeal rather than raw feeling. But it is not. The single biggest selling record Elvis Presley ever released is the loudest, wildest, most unapologetically rebellious thing he ever put his name on, the exact sound that terrified an older generation and set an entire younger generation on fire in the first place. There is something almost poetic about that. Decades of movie soundtracks, decades of Vegas ballads, decades of gospel records and international pop crossovers, and when you finally strip away the legend and the estimates and just look at the actual paperwork, it turns out the moment that defined him commercially more than any other single release was also the moment that defined him artistically. The scream, not the sentiment, is what actually moved the most units. That, to me, is the real lesson buried inside all of these conflicting numbers. Sales figures get inflated by decades of retelling. Interviews get repeated so many times they harden into accepted fact even when nobody can find the receipts. Global estimates swing wildly depending on which country's paperwork survived and which countries got lost or thrown away decades ago. But when you go back to the actual audited shipping ledgers, the cold, hard documented reality, it turns out the myths and the legends were not quite telling the full story. The raw, rebellious sound that first shocked the nation in 1956 remains. According to the real numbers, Elvis Presley's single greatest commercial triumph of his entire career, more than any Vegas ballad, more than any international chart topper, more than any gospel surprise hit that came along decades later. So which one of these 14 songs actually surprised you the most? Was it the German novelty track that barely registered in America but exploded across Europe? Was it the gospel record that sat in a vault for 5 years before quietly stunning the entire industry? Or was it finding out that the song at the very top of this list was not the polished pop ballad most casual fans would have guessed, but the loudest, wildest scream in his entire catalog? Let me know down in the comments which entry genuinely caught you off guard, because I read every single one of them. Before we wrap this up, I want to zoom out for a second, because I think there is something bigger going on here than just a fun trivia countdown, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Think about what it actually means that a superstar of this magnitude, someone whose face and voice are recognized on every continent on Earth, could not even keep his own sales history straight. This is not some obscure garage band from the 1950s whose paperwork got lost in a flood somewhere. This is Elvis Presley, arguably the single most documented entertainer of the 20th century, and even his own record label could not fully agree on the numbers. That tells you something important about how the music industry actually worked back then, and honestly, still works today in some ways. Sales figures were never as clean and scientific as we like to imagine. Before digital tracking, before SoundScan, before streaming data gave us a real-time, second-by-second picture of exactly what people were buying and listening to. The entire industry ran on shipping estimates, retailer self-reporting, and a whole lot of educated guessing dressed up as hard fact. Record labels had every incentive to round numbers up when it made for a better press release, and just as much incentive to keep certain overseas figures vague when international royalty payments were on the line. So when we talk about a song selling 5 million copies versus 20 million copies, we are not talking about a rounding error. We are talking about a gap large enough to completely change the outcome of a countdown like the one we just walked through together, and I think that ambiguity is actually part of why this story has stayed so compelling for over 60 years now. If the answer had been simple, if there had been one single, unambiguous, universally agreed upon number one hit from the very beginning, this conversation would have died out decades ago. Nobody would still be debating it. But because the paperwork is messy, because Elvis himself gave contradictory answers in different interviews over the years, because certain overseas markets kept better records than others, the mystery has genuinely stayed alive for generations of fans. Every few years, someone digs through an old warehouse, or a private collector's archive turns up an old internal memo, and the conversation reignites all over again. That is not really a flaw in the story. Honestly, I think it is the entire reason the story still works. There is also something worth noting about how differently we treat domestic sales versus international sales when we tell these stories, especially here in the United States. American audiences have a natural tendency to treat Billboard chart performance and domestic shipment numbers as the real, official record, while international sales, especially from countries whose reporting systems were less centralized in the 1950s and 1960s, get treated almost like a footnote. But if you actually respect the global numbers as seriously as the domestic ones, the entire shape of this countdown can shift dramatically. A song that barely registered on American radio but sold millions of copies across Europe is not a lesser hit. It is just a hit that the American press was never paying close enough attention to in real time. I think that is worth remembering. The next time you hear someone confidently declare, with total certainty, exactly what any classic artist's biggest song of all time really was, The full picture is almost always bigger, messier, and more international than the tidy version we grew up hearing, so at the end of the day, maybe the real takeaway from all of this is not really about which single song technically wins the crown. Maybe it is about what the entire messy, contradictory paper trail tells us about how legends actually get built in the first place. Not through one clean, official, universally agreed upon record, but through decades of estimates, half-remembered interviews, lost paperwork, and passionate fans who refuse to stop arguing about the details. Elvis Presley did not need a perfectly documented sales ledger to become the most influential entertainer of his century. The music did that on its own. The numbers, messy as they are just our way of trying to measure something that honestly might have always been a little too big to fully capture with a spreadsheet. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the real, documented numbers behind the legend, make sure you are subscribed here on American Stars. We are building this channel around exactly this kind of story, pulling apart the myths and the legends that have followed music history's biggest icons for decades, and showing you what the actual receipts and the actual paperwork really say. There are a lot more of these countdowns and investigations coming, so stick around, and I will see you in the next one.